Hello, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Wynne-Jones. I'm a professor in the archaeology department here in York. I specialise in African archaeology. I'm going to be chairing the event today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you. Before I introduce you to our speaker, can I just give you a couple of points of housekeeping? So in the very unlikely event of an emergency, follow the steward's instructions, and they will be helping you to evacuate the venue via the closest available exit. So please just get out as quickly as you can. And the other thing is, can I please just ask you to put your phones on silent or turn them off for this session, just to make sure we don't get disturbed. Okay, so let me move on to introduce you to our speaker this evening. I'm delighted to introduce you to Luke Pepera. He's a writer, broadcaster, historian and anthropologist dedicated to sharing his passion for African history and cultures. He was born in Ghana. He has a degree from St. Peter's College, Oxford, where he read archaeology and anthropology, and he also studied ancient and medieval African history. Since graduating, he's worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Times and Tatler, and has written and presented Africa Written Out of History, a documentary for Dan Snow's History Hit. Tonight, Luke will join me in a discussion about his new book, Motherland, a journey through 500,000 years of African culture and identity. It's quite a lot to take on. Over this session, Luke will draw from his book to tackle the questions many people of African descent ask. Who are we? Where do we come from? What defines us? And how might knowledge of deep history affect our understanding of our identity? And just to let you know, we're going to discuss the book between us for approximately 40 minutes or so, and then there will be a chance for you to ask questions as well. So if you have burning questions or things occur to you as we go through, please sort of hang on to them, hold that thought, and we'll take those questions at the end. So Luke, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me, and thank you for all of you for coming. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for such a kind introduction as well.
Okay, well, so why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about the book project and how it came about?
Yeah, sure. So the book, Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African Culture and Identity, explores, as the subtitle suggests, 500,000 years of African history in 10 thematic chapters. So each chapter covers a different aspect of African identity. These include migration and multiculturalism, oral literature, ancestral veneration, and depending on the theme, I go to a different part of Africa at a different time. So for example, for oral literature, I look at medieval West Africa, medieval Mali, but especially the groups of hereditary storytellers that existed there and still exist there, the griots in Mali. For migration and multiculturalism, I look at the medieval East African coast. I look at the Swahili and their 2,000-year-old trade across the Indian Ocean with Yemen, Oman, India, and China, and how those connections, how that trade, how that cultural contact influenced the Swahili, and indeed how the Swahili influenced the cultures and the people with whom they are trading. The point of the book, and this sort of goes to the origin as well, is that there's just so much African history, I think, generally, that we don't know. I think especially in our understanding of history, in world history, global history, the history of cultures, Africa is sort of left out and left behind. We don't know a lot about the achievements of African peoples, African cultures, African civilizations, if we know about the cultures themselves at all. There are names that people will know generally, so and achievements and civilizations people will know about generally, the Great Wall of China, but we don't know about the equivalents in Africa, about their history, and indeed even about them themselves. We don't know about Great Zimbabwe. We don't know about the Great Mosque, the 14th century Great Mosque, off the coast of Tanzania in East Africa. We don't know about one of the first universities in the world, so much Timbuktu in Mali, where people are doing cutting edge research in astronomy and medicine and law and Quranic studies. Our focus, or at least when we're thinking about African history, a lot of our knowledge, a lot of our perspective when it comes to the stories is really filtered through the last 300 years, that history encompassing the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. For a lot of us, that defines what African history is. that defines what African culture is, that defines who African people are. So I wanted to just give a sense of the deeper history that exists on the continent and some of the examples that represent that deeper history.
Okay, thank you. And actually, that is one of the notable aspects of this book, I think. It's the chronological scale. So you sort of start with, or do justice to, in the first chapter, some of the earliest ancestors of humankind, although I suppose a lot of the focus and a lot of the discussion is from what would be known in Europe as the medieval period and beyond. But I just wondered, actually, why you kept that deeper past in at all in some ways. That must have been quite challenging to connect through.
Yeah, so in the first chapter, Our Lost Millennia, the first chapter of the book, I actually begin with a section on human origins. The origin of our of our species, but the first, what we would call human beings, sort of in the academic literature and archaeology known as hominids, but the earliest human beings that existed in the world, and with the best available linguistic, archaeological, paleoarchaeological, anthropological, ethnographic, genetic evidence, we're almost 100% certain that human beings, but those Homo sapiens, originated in Africa, precisely in East Africa, Ethiopia or Kenya. There's some debate as to which part. There's some evidence of ancient human beings also being discovered in Morocco as well. But generally, the region is what encompasses now Ethiopia, Kenya. So it's East Africa. So we know that's where human beings originated, and obviously that history is very hard for us to access, but we have evidence that people existed at this time, but then also that they were doing things. They were making art. They were farming. They were migrating. They were engaged in human activity, the stuff that makes up history. So I just want, again, so going back to that point of just trying to make people understand the richness of the African past, again, going beyond the last 300 years, encompassing the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. I just want to give people a sense of how deep this history really is. It goes all the way back to the beginning of our species, and everything else, is just it fills in the gap. So obviously I do a lot of the medieval stuff. I think evidence, one, but also when I'm talking about stories, figures, that's where a lot of the evidence is. But I wanted to start with the human origins, just give people a sense that, culture, civilizations, societies, practices have existed in Africa longer than in any other continent in the world. So that's the place where, if we want to understand the real stuff of history, the depth of history, we need to be looking. That was, focusing on that, I think, or at least describing that, I think was really important for me to get that point across, that there is just a wealth of information, and it extends back, not just to the ancient civilizations of maybe 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, but potentially 7 million years ago. The earliest human ancestor, who existed 7 million years ago in Chad, the hominid or the human ancestor is known as Sahelanthropus chadensis, which means Sahel man of Chad. And 7 million years ago is when our evolutionary line split from that of chimpanzees. And that first human being existed in Africa, existed in Chad. So what were the people? What was Sahelanthropus, that society, doing? What were the later sort of hominids doing, from Homo erectus to Homo habilis to Homo heidelbergensis, all the way down to Homo sapiens? Homo sapiens, our species, as it were, emerged or originated in Africa 150,000 years ago. So that's actually remarkably recent, when you take into account how far back that history goes. But even beginning then, 150,000 years ago, there's that wealth of information. So yeah, it was just really to get across the point of the depth and the wealth of stories, of history, of culture that exists in this continent that is so often overlooked.
Yeah, thank you. I think from my perspective as well, I did know about the sort of the ancient origins of hominids there, and I also knew about some of the more recent stuff. But it's very rare, actually, to see those things put into conversation with each other, and I think that's one really notable and lovely aspect of the book, is to try and think about that sort of long-term human history on the continent, and sort of try to think about it all in as a grand whole. And I wanted to ask you a question about that, actually, about sort of thinking about Africa, because I think it can be quite a challenge for people that work on African pasts, because I think there's a tension between writing very particular stories and sort of trying to say Africa's not all the same, it's not a country, it's a continent, there's a lot of different things going on, but then also trying to pull out sort of something African, and I think that's something that you do really well with your thematic approach. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about those themes and how they presented themselves to you. Was it obvious to you you were going to go that way, or did you have to sort of work to say, okay, what am I going to find that I can think of as Pan-African?
Yes, that's a great question. I think there are. I mean, Africa is the most arguably the most diverse continent on the planet, not just in terms of languages or cultures, but even ethnicity, and even to an extent skin color and race. And the reason for that is partly to do with what I was talking about earlier about human beings originating in Africa. And we have this sense of this kind of direct linear evolutionary line when it comes to understanding how we as a species came about, and that's not how it worked. What happened is that over the millions of years that our early ancestors lived in Africa, they were actually different species who inhabited the continent simultaneously, and they usually lived in different parts where they were subjected to different selection pressures, so they developed differently, these different populations, and that's how they became different species. But then they also migrated across the continent, mixed with one another, so there was that interbreeding between them, and then when they did, new species kind of came about because of that interbreeding, and they shared the traits of all the people and all the ancestors, all the different groups that had come before to make them what they are. And it was through that continuous process of migrating and mixing and ending up at different places and living there for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and developing differently because of those different selection pressures that eventually led to the traits that make us who we are, our bipedalism, our larger brain in relation to our bodies, all those kinds of things. So I was very conscious of that diversity, and the reason for that diversity early on. I mean, I was born and grew up in Ghana, and even as I was coming to school here, would always go back, and I had a sense of the things that were important generally in Ghanaian culture, but then not just in Ghanaian culture. When I, as I sort of interacted with Africans from different places, I noticed that there were things that also were common between us and that bound us together. So, for example, the community in Africa is incredibly important, family and community, and by extension, in a lot of African cultures, though not in all of them, the role of women in those cultures, those who are primarily important in sort of regenerating the community, and then at the ancestors was something that's absolutely crucial. Those who've achieved great things in life, but then who've passed and moved on to the spirit world, and that we still respect and that we still venerate. And then oral literature. I mean, I think Africa is a unique place where the majority of the cultures, a lot of the cultures still tell their stories, remember the past, remember the history through oral literature. There's writing in a lot of them. There's writing in Egypt, there's writing in Sudan, there was writing in East Africa, but for the most part, oral histories and oral literature, songs, stories, and also material culture, artifacts, art. These are the things that are kind of common across African cultures. And it's not so much that there's a diversity in the things that Africans do. I think that's where you can generalize, not even just with regards to Africans, but with regards to people in general. I mean, family is an important theme, I think, for everybody, no matter the culture, but there's a certain kind of attitude towards community and towards the elders, etc., that might be particular, I think, to African people. So where the difference and the huge diversity comes in is how people do things. So that's how I could balance things. I knew that, for example, in every African culture, the ancestors are important, but what they're called, how they're venerated, why they're respected, all these different things kind of differ between African cultures. And a lot of them, for example, venerating the ancestors relies on maybe community or even national ceremonies. In others, it can be more of a personal thing, building a shrine to a particular ancestor, and pouring what's called libations, this kind of alcoholic drink on the ground as an offering. So that might not be common everywhere. And then also, who the ancestors are, what they represent. For some people, they might be people directly who'd kind of lived and died in the society and could actually be identified physically. For others, they might be more ephemeral and more powerful. So they're the Orishas, for example, of the Yoruba, the Nigerian culture, and they're considered ancestors, but they're almost I mean, if I would liken them almost to like deities. They're almost like the Greek gods in a way. They're kind of gods of different aspects, and they have this sort of phenomenal power in the society, and they're kind of seen as the founders of certain aspects, but they're also considered ancestors. It's not the same thing. That might not be the same thing, for example, for the Lobi of Burkina Faso, where their ancestors, Tila, are a little bit more, they're nowhere near as powerful. They're not identified with certain aspects, but still in the different cultures, these two beings are respected and are venerated. So that was, I think I knew the things that were, that sort of bound us together more generally. And then when I was talking about diversity, I say, well, look at, the manifold ways in which Africans kind of think about these, in different African cultures, people think about, these similar concepts, or in fact the same concept, how they deal with them and how they practice things related to them. So that was the way in which I found I could get at both things, giving a sense of what Africa is more generally and what it means to be African identity, whilst also celebrating the diversity that exists on the continent.
Thank you. That's great answer. So I'm glad that you mentioned women, actually, because I thought this was quite a striking part of your book, that women actually loom very large in a lot of the stories that you tell, and you have a chapter about sort of queens and queen mothers and powerful women, and I don't know, I wanted just to give you a little bit of space, maybe just to talk about that. Were there any sort of stories of powerful women that particularly appealed to you? Are there any stories you think the audience would love to know about them?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, lots. So I think this is an interest, and actually, as I was kind of writing the book, my views on, or just my understanding of women, I think in African cultures more generally, and also in particular African cultures, was kind of changing. Because what you see in a lot of African cultures, my own included, like say I'm from Ghana, one of the main ethnic groups there, which I belong to, is the Ashanti. And in the Ashanti, we have a figure called the Queen Mother, who is, she's usually the mother of the Ashanti king. And it's strange because she doesn't really engage that much operationally in the kingdom. It's sort of the king who handles day-to-day affairs, etc. But she does. So, for example, she has her own government to an extent. She has her own law court, but the king is kind of, and she's recognised as being the most important figure in that society. Even though a lot of people kind of deal day-to-day with the king. So there was almost, even in the female-led or female-dominated societies, there was this kind of balance. It's the same thing actually in the Igbo culture as well of Nigeria. But there was historically, in some cases it was a little bit different. So there's one queen. So this is in one of the chapters of the book, Queen Mothers and Warrior Queens, which is the name of the chapter. I look at a queen of 17th century Ndongo, the kingdom of Ndongo, which existed in what's now northern Angola, and the queen's name is Njinga Mbande, and she was actually the first queen, female ruler of this kingdom. Women in her culture, the culture is called the Mbundu culture, had always been important and venerated. They'd always been an important part of government, of political affairs. Women had also had a lot of social and cultural freedom in the society as well. There was no pressure, for example, to get married, to find a husband, or even to stick with a husband that you felt wasn't treating you correctly, etc. You could always go back to your father's homestead, and you could live independently in whichever way you wish. And especially royal women in that society, in this Mbundu culture, had always had quite remarkable autonomy. And again, in the medieval era, and also in the early modern era where Njinga was living, and she's remarkable. Njinga, she's sort of she's born in the 1580s, so she's sort of late 16th century to mid to late 17th century. She lives until her 70s, but she's remembered in Angola and amongst the contemporary Mbundu, but also historical Mbundu as well, as having essentially protected her kingdom in Ndongo from the expansion and the colonial ambitions of the Portuguese. So when she was very young is when the Portuguese sort of started making inroads, first into the kingdom in the north, Congo, and then later on in Ndongo. And you know, that sort of early contact and that early relationship was sort of fair and bilateral. But as kind of Portuguese ambitions grew, then became a greater desire for wanting to conquer, in particular in Ndongo, because the Portuguese had quite a strong alliance with Congo itself. It was actually the Congolese who gave them Luanda as their capital, as their base of operations. Obviously now the Angolan capital, because that was part of Congo then. But you know, Njinga, you know, so during Njinga's childhood, the Portuguese are kind of making, you know, this sort of starts off a trade, but then they start trying to conquer certain aspects of, conquer certain parts of Ndongo. And in fact, the Portuguese king gives this Portuguese official, de Noves, a charter saying he should found the kingdom of Angola. So that's actually what the name. Angola was the name of the Congolese and the Portuguese called the Ndongo king. So the charter was said you need to colonize Ndongo and found this kingdom which will be belong to, or at least be part of, the expanding Portuguese empire. So de Noves, in doing this, he basically starts fighting against Njinga's grandfather and also her father as well. And this is the kind of the background. This is sort of in Njinga's childhood. She sort of is aware of all these conflicts with the Portuguese. So when she, you know, as she's growing up, it's actually her brother who takes over. So her grandfather sort of fails to stall the Portuguese. Her father also fails. Then her brother takes over. And in the Mbundu culture, coming to when succession was elective. So usually it would be the elders and the high officials who would choose who would be the next leader. But because it was elective, it wasn't that the eldest son took over. Sometimes the succession processes could be particularly brutal, because you had a greater, obviously, chance of gaining the throne if you managed to eliminate your rivals. And this is what Njinga's brother does. Ngola Mbande, you know, he kills his half brother. He kills his cousins and his nephews, and then he also has Njinga, and he also has his two other sisters as well, his and Njinga's sisters, Kambu and Fungi, as the historical records tell us, are forcibly sterilized. So apparently this hot mixture of boiling herbs is poured onto their stomachs. And by that time, Njinga had a child with a male concubine, actually, called Kiyo Tushi. And Mbande has that child killed, and then he has Njinga and his sisters sterilized. And Njinga goes into exile and you know, into a nearby kingdom called Matamba. And then, you know, Mbande, again, is trying to make a deal with the Portuguese. The Portuguese recruit these roaming bands of Mbundu mercenaries called Imbangala, who are known for their brutal practices. So the Portuguese, with them, he's kind of trying to, you know, sort of recruits them in order to try conquer Kabasa, which is the capital of Ndongo. And Ngola Bande is losing, etc. And then he comes to a point where he thinks that he might be able to make peace with the Portuguese. And in order to do that, he feels he needs to recall Njinga back from exile, because she's popular, especially amongst her people, and kind of feels that he would gain support for this peace treaty if she has her back. So she goes there. She goes back to the kingdom, and she also manages to hash out this. The Portuguese actually invite her to Luanda. She goes there with this massive entourage of 200 people, and she's wearing Mbundu dress and feathers in her hair and everything. And she goes there and she hashes out a deal with the Portuguese. But actually, she starts plotting to take the throne. So one of the things she does, so they make this peace treaty, but actually the Portuguese are kind of slow on acting on it. And Ngola Mbande, her brother, feels very anxious that they're not. That they're not agreeing to the parts that they said they would. They're not doing the things that they said they would. So he becomes very anxious. He actually falls into a little bit of depression, and Njinga doesn't help this. She basically lambasts him for allowing the Portuguese to continue to make inroads into Ndongo, etc. And the pressure mounts on Mbande so much, to the extent that as we're sort of told historically, either is that he apparently commits suicide, either that or Njinga kind of has him poisoned, and then she also has his son, who's staying with this Imbangala leader called Kasa. She has him assassinated as well, and then she takes over the throne basically, and then she herself starts fighting against the Portuguese, and she does so for about 50 years. She leads campaign against them. And she, even at one point, for example, she becomes an Imbangala herself. She makes an alliance with them in order to defeat the Portuguese. But later on in life, after fighting against them for decades, she develops this strategy of, on the one hand, trying to seek peace with them, whilst also continuing to fight against them, especially in the areas where she felt they were weakest, in the areas where they'd only newly got territory in Ndonga, etc. And essentially, after several decades, the Portuguese, and for a lot of this time, she's actually living in a war camp in the bush. So she's basically, and even the Portuguese, you have a lot of Portuguese writing that she's like some Amazon. She's this warrior queen who we can't get rid of, and she basically fights against them so much that actually the Portuguese, after a few decades, basically say it's too expensive to keep on fighting against her. We need to come to a peace agreement. So they do in about the 1650s, and as part of that agreement, she's given a lot back of the traditional lands, lands of Ndongo. She's given back. She's given this kingdom of Matamba. She's recognised as both the queen of Matamba and Ndongo, and also as part of the treaty, she agrees to sort of renounce a lot of her traditional practices, especially the Mbangala ways, and adopt Catholicism. But she is remembered as the one when her grandfather couldn't do it, when her father couldn't do it, when her brother couldn't do it, was the individual who managed basically to fight against the Portuguese in such a way that at the end of the day, they had to sue for peace. And what's interesting about Njinga's story is that it kind of, when it comes to a lot of female leaders, warrior queens, queen mothers in African history and in African culture, you notice this is actually a similar trend, beginning even extending all the way back to the ancient period, the ancient world. So there's a queen, a Nubian queen of Nubia in what's now northern Sudan, southern Egypt. This is 2,000 years ago. So about 2,000 years ago, this queen Amanirenas, and she basically does a similar thing against the Romans as Njinga does against the Portuguese. And then you also have in Ashanti culture as well, you have the Queen Ya Santewa, who does a similar thing against the British as well. So they're actually, and this is where these queens are kind of remembered, and where especially female figures are kind of remembered. They always seem to be the last stand against this kind of encroaching, these encroaching influences, and because the men often, again, in these histories, are kind of seen as the people who take a softer approach. They're always trying to make an agreement with the dominant power. They see that as the best way of kind of ensuring the continuance of their kingdom and the preservation of their societies. But these queens, these warrior queens, as I mentioned, with Njinga, are always seen as the last stand, as people who never give in until the end. And I think Njinga's story is I find Njinga's story absolutely fascinating because of her resilience. All the things, like I mentioned, the things that she'd gone through, the things that she had to do, just given the broad brush strokes, and yet, as I say, fights against the Portuguese for 50 years and never gives up, never backs down. So that resilience, to me, is something that is particularly admirable.
I agree, actually. Njinga's my favourite. She's very fierce and she's wonderful. I mean, I don't know if you'd want to meet her, really. She's also terrifying, but she's fabulous.
No, you wouldn't, especially if you were a man in her society. Apparently, she had several hundred male concubines. She sometimes even used to, if they displeased her, used to execute at will. So she was quite ruthless, and she grew up in a ruthless environment, but. Again, and that's partly what makes her so charismatic, because but she saw herself as this kind of powerful queen, as this role in society, and doing what she needed to do to ensure her kingdom's protection.
Absolutely. So I think you've probably got the idea that one of the wonderful things about this book, I think, is that it moves between sort of general, broad-scale histories, and then it has this whole series of individual stories. Some of them historical individuals, like Njinga, but actually there's a really varied range. We sort of go across African kings, New York rappers, Hollywood stars, Windrush victims. We've got this whole sort of suite of individuals who emerge through these themes out of the book. And I just wanted to ask you, who's your favourite?
Oh, my favourite. Yes, so just quickly to explain, the book, like I said, I do these 10 chapters on these different themes and aspects of African identity, but, I wanted to I look as well as the historical characters. I look at more contemporary, modern characters, and the reason for that is just to give a sense of, again, so, I think in a lot of, for a lot of African people, we don't always have that similar clear distinction between past and present. Time kind of flows into, the past, present, future all kind of flow into one another. There's this continuance. There's a sense of a collapsed time. I mentioned the ancestors. A lot of ancestors people venerate, today could have been people who died several hundred years ago. So there's that, and would, in some cases would speak to them, or even if they're more recent, would speak to them as though they were still living. And I think part of the reason for that is because African societies are so old. We just have, we almost see just time as this flow, as this collapsible flow. So, and again, I think it was interesting for me to look at ways in which sort of contemporary, even in modern examples and contemporary examples, you can see evidence of these really ancient practices. So actually, one of my favorite contemporary examples or people in the book is the actor Chadwick Boseman. Passed away a few years ago, and he was the star and the lead of Black Panther, which of course threw up a lot of questions about African history and African culture and African identity. But what was interesting about him, and he's in the ancestral veneration chapter, and the reason for that is because when he died, you had a lot of African peoples or peoples of African descent, African heritage, whether that was in South Africa or America, wherever, describing him as an ancestor. And essentially what an ancestor, so in Africa we believe that people believe that when someone that death isn't the end of things. Basically, when someone dies, it's a simple transition from them moving from the living world, or the mortal world, the physical world in which we are now into the spiritual world or the metaphysical world, where people continue to live, and they collectively we call those people who've moved on, live in the spirit world, the living dead. And ancestors are a special kind of living dead. So they're those people again who achieved great things in life before they moved on, and Chadwick Boseman was kind of one of these people because of his, he was always someone who was very concerned with showing the positive aspects of African American history, African American culture. He said himself he never really wanted to play victims. He always he played great sort of African American heroes, as well, Thurgood Marshall, first African American Supreme Court Justice, and then obviously T'Challa, and then James Brown. So T'Challa's Black Panther, and then obviously James Brown, Jackie Robinson. These people, which had a profound impact on on the audience and to an extent on the ways in which people. In America, but more broadly, but in America, including African Americans, viewed African American culture, African American history, African American contributions to that continent and to that society, and because of that, he was recognized as being someone who'd achieved something special. So when he died, he was called an ancestor. He was reckoned to be an ancestor in the same way that someone who'd achieved something in Africa, whether it was something for the community, they were a great doctor, they healed many people, or whatever it was. Would be seen as in the same way. It was I found that really interesting and really engaging, for him to be considered in that way, and for me to link that, especially to continental and indigenous practices. And one that's very odd. Historically, I'd probably say my favorite character, one of my favorite characters in the book is Mansa Musa, who I talk about in the first chapter. So he's this early 14th century, late 13th, early 14th century emperor of Mali in West Africa, and he is he's mainly remembered because of this extraordinary, just for me, phenomenal pilgrimage he makes to Mecca in the early 14th century, in the 1320s. And the Mali, the empire, which existed from about maybe the 10th or 11th centuries, maybe a little bit later. Very early on, from about the 12th century onwards, had been Muslim, and that's because it was plugged into the Trans-Saharan trade network. So it was trading. It would move gold from further south, what's now Ghana. Traders from there across North Africa and into the Mediterranean, and then also into Western Asia, where a lot of Muslim culture societies were, and that there was a sort of global Muslim community, and Muslim traders were some of the most active, some of the wealthiest, some of the best traveled. So in order to develop their relationship with these traders and with these rulers, the Mali elite and Malian merchants adopted Islam themselves. So that's the world, and that's the background that Musa kind of inhabits. That's what he comes into. And what's also fascinating about Musa, he's born in about the 1280s, and he becomes emperor in the 1310s. Some say 1307 or maybe 1312, but he becomes emperor basically by accident. So his father, Abu Bakr II, had this great exploring spirit, and he wanted to know what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. He became obsessed with finding it out. So in the early 1300s, he basically gets together a fleet of several hundred ships, and he fills them with gold and food and water, and he organizes for several thousand sailors, to take these ships and to sail them across the Atlantic, and to see to send word if they find land, basically. And what happens is that after a few years, only one ship comes back, and the captain of the ship basically says that there was a whirlpool in the middle of the ocean when we were sailing. I was at the back, all the ships in front of me got sucked into it, so I decided to come back. I think it was a very wise decision on his part, to be fair. He turns around and he comes back, but Abu Bakr doesn't believe him, and says, so I'm going to organize another expedition, which I'm going to lead myself, because he'd been absolutely useless. He didn't do anything. So he organizes several thousand ships to be filled with gold, food, and water, and gets a fleet together, completely manned, and sails. He puts Musa, his son, in, makes him regent, and he sails across. He sets off, probably off the coast of Guinea, so modern Guinea, off the West African coast, sails off into the Atlantic, into the distance, and is never seen again, basically. So Musa ends up, by default, becoming the emperor, and then a few years later, tragedy strikes when Musa accidentally kills his mother, we're told, possibly in a ceremony. So in Mali, the elite, including all the noblemen, including or the nobility, including the emperor, were allowed to wear bows and arrows around town, so quivers and bows around town, and could walk around with those. That was like a special privilege of theirs. And often in ceremonies, there would be the firing of bows and arrows. So we don't know exactly, but it's possible that Musa accidentally killed his mother, or during one of these ceremonies in which arrows were being fired. One of them, struck his mother or accidentally hit his mother. But she also dies a few years after he becomes emperor in about the 1310s, and he's feels so remorseful, and he asks his priest, his imams, his Muslim priest, what he should do, and the governor of his capital, Niani, what he should do. And they basically say you have to visit the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, in modern day Saudi Arabia, and pray there for Allah's forgiveness, basically. So and because Medina, and as a Muslim, Musa also had to make, one of the requirements of being a Muslim is that you also have to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, and Musa hasn't done this yet, so he decides, okay, as I'm going to Medina, I'll also visit Mecca. And as I'm traveling this great distance through many kingdoms, some of which are Mali's allies, or a lot of which are Mali's allies and trade partners, etc., I'm going to impress them with the wealth and the might and the splendor of Mali. So it's not just going to be a normal pilgrimage; it's going to be the most extravagant pilgrimage I can possibly do. So he starts the preparations, and they take almost a year in the early 1320s, and he gathers together 60,000 of his subjects. 15,000 camels, which he loads with hundreds of kilograms of gold, and they make this 5,000 mile 8-month journey across, out of Mali and across the Sahara into North Africa, and then they through Egypt, and on the way to what's now Saudi Arabia. And in Egypt, they take a break. They camp outside on their way to Mecca. They camp out, or Medina and Mecca. They camp outside the pyramids of Giza. And the Mamluks, the Mamluk dynasty, the Mamluk people who are ruling Egypt at the time, they hear of this commotion. These 60,000 people outside the pyramids of Giza, and they think it's an invading army. So a scouting expedition is sent out to find out what's going on. And the leader of the expedition, when he finds out that it's actually just a camp of pilgrims, says, "In all my life, I've never seen anything like this. This camp competes in glittering glory with the African sun itself." He's so overawed by the splendor and by the extravagance, and he invites Musa to come into Cairo, because one of the requirements, as sort of Mamluk protocol has it, is that any visitor has to see the Sultan, who in this time is a figure called Al-Nazir Muhammad, who's a particularly accomplished but also ruthless leader, especially in Mamluk Egypt, especially as far as the history of Mamluk Egypt is concerned. So Musa, he's persuaded to go, but actually when they're in Cairo and the leader of the expedition is sort of trying to take him to Al-Nazir Muhammad, and he says, and Musa, knowing that this is what he'll have to do when he sees him, knowing Mamluk court protocol, is really reluctant to go see the Sultan, and the leader of the expedition keeps saying, "No, we have to go see him, and Musa keeps on trying to put him off, eventually he manages to persuade him to go. But when he's in Al-Nazir's court, in front of him, in front of his officials, in front of his guards and his soldiers, Musa and the leader of the expedition, after bringing him in, tells him to bow before the Sultan and kiss the ground before him and kiss his hand as he's supposed to. And Musa basically refuses, and things get quite tense, and there's possibly going to be a diplomatic spat, until one of Musa's advisors whispers something in his ear, and then Musa goes forward and he kneels on the ground and he says, "I prostrate myself in honor of Allah," essentially. And that's what the advisor told him to do. He said that if you bow to the ground in honor of Allah instead of honor of Al-Nazir, Al-Nazir wouldn't dispute that because he's a pious Muslim himself. True to the advisor's word, Al-Nazir is not offended in the slightest. He invites Musa to come up. They talk and they exchange gifts. And Musa basically gifts to all the Mamluk officials some of the gold that he's brought, and they describe it as just being raw, unworked gold that has basically just been dug out the ground, put on the camels' backs, and taken. Also, some of it is also gold, like gold dust as well. During that time, that's how gold was commonly transported, and some of it is actually worked gold ornaments. So, for example, there are at least 500 gold rods that some of the pilgrims are carrying. But he basically just gifts the Mamluks, the Egyptians, just tons and tons of gold. And then also what happens is that whilst he's there having his audience with Al-Nazir, the pilgrims who've been welcomed into the city are going in and about the markets, and they're seeing all these wonderful wares like Venetian glass and all the Mamluk crafts and artifacts like silver bowls and all these kinds of things, and they are buying shirts and clothes, and they're buying as much as they can, all these wonderful souvenirs. And the Cairo merchants, in order to profit off them, are basically raising their prices, sometimes 5 times as much as one would ordinarily pay. But what happens is that because Musa had gifted so much gold, and because the Malians have been spending so much gold, essentially they flood the market with gold, so its value decreases and the price of everything shoots up, and actually it leads to mass inflation in the country. And when the Mamluk officials realize this, they go to Musa and they basically beg him to do something. So Musa says, "Okay, I'll borrow back all the gold that my people have spent and that I've given to you." And the Cairene merchants, the merchants Cairo engineer some way in order that when he pays it back, you have to pay back slightly more than he'd borrowed back. But taking back all the gold, Musa continues his journey. He does what he needs to in Medina and Mecca. He comes back, obviously taking the same or a similar route, goes back to his capital, Niani, in Mali. And there he pays back all the gold he owes the Cairene merchants, plus the extra that he owes them. And what happens is that gold once again floods the Cairene economy, reducing and there's a traveller, Al-Umari, who visits Cairo 10 years after Musa's visit, and he says that the inflation because of Musa's visit is still affecting Cairo today, because he spent so much gold in the kingdom, and this affects not only the gold market of Egypt but also of Africa, the entire continent, where the price of everything increases because of this huge influx, unexpected huge influx of gold from Musa, as well as in Western Asia, and also in the Mediterranean, and even to an extent in Western Europe as well, because a lot of the gold that's used, for example, in Western painting, or for the frames of Western paintings and portraiture, is actually coming from Mali. It's coming from Mali through North Africa, the Mediterranean, and ends up in Western Europe. So even there, the price of gold is price of things is affected because of Musa's largesse. And then stories start to circulate. This is the 14th century, so this is before any direct contact between Western Europe and West Africa more generally, but Mali specifically. But stories start to circulate of this incredibly gold-rich place, gold-rich kingdom, and that's actually when you start to see some of the first European expeditions to try and find this African El Dorado, as it's called. So Musa kind of unwittingly ushers in as well, potentially, this direct contact between Western Europe and Africa, which and then all the history that comes after that, begins with that wealth. But I think his, Musa's, and another thing, that I think would be more important to mention is that coming back from Mecca and Medina, these are, especially during the pilgrimage season, these are where some of the greatest Islamic minds gather, or some of the greatest lawyers and engineers, etc., from across the Muslim world gather. And Musa recruits some of them and brings them back to Mali. And whilst he's been away, his top general Saran Mandian has conquered this town in sort of into the east of the empire called Timbuktu. And when Musa comes back, he leaves some of these scholars in Timbuktu, and he commissions the building of certain centers of learning, or he builds basically mosques which become centers of learning, and leaves the scholars there. And he also brings back books and encourages the scholars to start producing books, and in that way he founds one of the first universities in the world, which is Timbuktu. So I think Musa's particularly interesting for me, not just because of his not just because of his impact, but I think also he's I think as a leader he's particularly interesting. He's obviously there's a sense of him wanting to demonstrate, to increase his own prestige with his actions. But again, one of the first things, he does, and probably the biggest thing he does when he, with his wealth, and when he comes back, is to establish this public institution, which is to do with helping to improve his kingdom. And he also even he uses the lawyers that he brings back to transform Mali's legal system, and he actually reduces the power of the Mansa. So traditionally, the emperor, the Mansa, was judge, juror, and executioner, and Musa actually alters the constitution so that the roles of the jury and the judiciary, etc., are actually separate. So he reduces his own power in order to make his society better, his society more fair. So I think that's rare in in a lot of leaders, but particularly in a medieval leader as well, and someone who had so much power, so much sway. So he's someone who I think when it comes to African history is kind of is somewhat well known, but I think he just, as you know, the more that I learn about Africa, the more that I'm just continue to be impressed by his by his character and by his activities.
Absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you. And I think anyone that takes their great wealth and invests it in a university is someone I can get on board with.
Exactly.
I do have other questions I can ask, but I actually am going to hold them back because I think perhaps some of you may have some questions that you want to ask, and I want to make sure we make some space for that. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask? Yes. So we've got... yes. Yes, please. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone.
Is this on?
We'll have you and then you afterwards.
Sorry, who?
At the back.
Hi, thank you, Luke. Look forward to reading your book. And apologies if you cover this in your book, but you know, sounds very interesting, looking at the sort of roots of the world in Africa. But as you look forward, Africa today is about 15% of the world's population, forecast to be 25% by 2050, 40% by 2100, and among the world's top 10 countries will be Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, DRC. So are we, in the same way that we've been living through sort of India, China, are we going to live through Africa over the next 50 years? And if not, why not?
So that's a great question. A lot of people, you know, in fact, this is something that I'm, you know, potentially thinking about working on next. But as you say, there's a huge amount of potential on the continent. I think to a certain extent, I agree with you. And in fact, Africa is often overlooked in this regard. A lot of people focus on China. A lot of people focus on India in terms of population, education, etc. And Africa in a lot of ways is kind of seen as this. For the majority, I mean, not that it doesn't exist, but you know, this poverty-stricken, war-torn environment, which I say, but you know, it's a kind of generally a resetting of the equilibrium. You know, historically, before the European expeditions, especially to the Americas, and the changes happening there, not only the transfer of wealth, things like silver from the Americas, or what's happening in with Peru and the Inca and the Aztec, etc. That transfer of wealth, but then also the development of the plantation economies there. That's where I think you saw the foundation and the origin of in the beginning of kind of the European rise. But before that, in the 15th century, for thousands of years, it was like I talk a little bit again about the book about these Indian Ocean trade, with East Africa. Things were oriented east for the most part. People talk about the Silk Roads, but actually that Indian Ocean trade was a big deal. And as you say, Africa is does have that potential in terms of population, in terms of talent and skill, and in terms of resources, natural resources. We're seeing a trade. I think the biggest barriers have been, for example, a lack of control over those resources. A lot of people like to talk about colonization, the European angle, but actually it also extends east as well. There'll be some cases where Chinese mining companies are acquiring mines and the resources from mines at a fraction of what they're worth. I mean, there are some mines or resources in Africa, resource areas that are worth trillions, which might be acquired for just multiples of millions, which is just nothing what they're worth, but by the Chinese as well. But I think that resource control and navigating that will be a big challenge, even though there is that potential. So I think if we do that as well, that would be a way in which we could kind of harness that potential. And then I think the other thing would be governance, which I think is sort of in a crisis globally, but I think in Africa is still, in my opinion, is still our biggest issue, and that's one of the reasons again why I admire and like to talk about Mansa Musa, because he's an example, I think, of the kinds of the ways in which the wealth should be used. But I don't generally see that, and there is still, there's still huge pockets of poverty in places where it should not exist, like in the DRC, which is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, and yet one of the poorest. does not make, well, not that it doesn't make any sense, but, it's obvious that the challenges are, yes, yes, conflict, yes, some of that history, Belgian colonization was particularly pernicious, but, things like contemporary governance, contemporary alliances would be significant in helping us to harness that potential. So.
If quick follow-up, I mean, I think people tend to focus on the economics and resources and all that sort of thing, but obviously your book is focused on culture and identity. What if Africa is 40% of the world's population? How will that shape the world's culture and identity?
Yeah, I think to an extent, I think you see now much broader cultural reach. I remember speaking, for example, to my friend who lives in the US, and he was talking about Afrobeats, African music being played, for example, in American like malls and supermarkets at a point where it wouldn't already. I think you might see fashion growing, like fashion trends, food, etc., and also certain technological cultural developments coming out of the continent. I mean, for example, gaming and the gaming sector and video games is growing in Africa at an alarming rate. I mean, Nollywood, the Nigerian film studio, now makes more films than Bollywood and Hollywood combined. And with the rise of global streaming, you're going to see more of those films being made and more of those films reaching a wider audience. I think that would start to introduce people to, especially to contemporary African culture, in a way that they might not have been exposed to before.
Thank you. I think we had another question here. Can you?
Hiya. So I'm a local history teacher, and I've been trying to diversify the curriculum a little bit. Year 7 love Mansa Musa. However, they have lots of questions. One of the ones is it true he built a mosque every Friday? And if so, how is that logistically possible? Because I don't want to bluff them off for another year, basically.
Oh, yeah, thank you for asking. So, yes, I hope they'll be satisfied with this answer. Obviously, you're the ones who have to face them. I mean, essentially what was your name, sorry? Just quickly. Emma. So what Emma is alluding to is that when Musa traveled to Mecca, basically everywhere the train, his pilgrimage stopped, or the pilgrim stopped on a Friday, he built a mosque. That's sort of what it said. But I think they're very rare. So historically, in the way that it might have actually happened in reality, is that either every Friday he commissioned a mosque to be built. So he didn't actually wait until it was fully built, but he had enough people to leave in a particular place, or even just to pay for the people who were in the area where he'd stopped, for them to build a mosque as he moved on. Or that he sort of had this collapsible kind of portable mosque that he kind of erected every Friday as he was moving through. But I think it was actually the former, is that he funded mosques, basically. So he commissioned them to be built in the area, but it wasn't as though he they started the building and he waited for them to be finished before he moved on. So
That's what I said. So.
Okay, good. Well, you got it right then.
Thank you. Yes, I think we have one more here. Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, we'll come to you next.
Hi, my name's Emily, and I've worked quite a bit in East Africa, West Africa and North Africa, and I've recently returned from a trip working in West Africa. And every time I'm working in Africa and every time I come back, my head's a bit blown by the diversity of African culture and identities. And I was just wondering, from all the work that you've done and all the thinking that you've done, can you see something that you could name as some kind of essence or something that is pervasive between all these different cultures and identities? Because obviously you've got it in the singular in your title, and I'm assuming you don't think it's one culture and one identity. But in some areas I can see some things that trickle along, but I don't think I've probably got any much, near experience of you considering these things.
Sure. I think that's a good question. I think continuity of practice is a big one. Just the sense that we're always very conscious. Every African culture is very conscious of what has come before and how it applies to their own life and to their own community today. That sense of deep remembrance and of paying homage to past aspects, people of the past, things of the past, cultures of the past, practices of the past, in order to maintain an understanding of who we are. I think is a big one, and I that's, I would say, the general practice. But obviously, when it comes to who people are or what they feel they are, that differs. But I noticed that in every, that sense of, and again, that goes back to that sense of community and that sense of, identity, both localized and also more generally as well. I would say that's the thing that binds a lot of African people, no matter the culture to which they belong, together. And I think that's the foundation of our commonality, is the sense that we all have this deep reverence. And again, it even extends to our respect and reverence for the elders, for elderly people. It's all about remembering and respecting and paying homage to things that have come before, and recognizing that deep past and that deep history. That's something that I've noticed, I think, whilst in my reading, but then also in interacting with Africans of different kinds, that doesn't really, I think connects us together, but that doesn't really change. So, I hope that answers your question. But yes, I would say that's the essence.
Thank you. Now, we are running out of time, but I noticed we've got one more question here. So, shall we take a quick one? Yes.
It's not so quick. You mentioned Mali.
Sorry, do you mind using the microphone?
You mentioned the historical links with Mali. Could you say anything, if it's relevant to your book in some sense, about the recent and current conflict within Mali and neighbouring countries, and the role of ISIS, Islamic extremism, and all this sort of stuff that's sort of not interfering with the sort of things you've been talking about, really?
Yes, well, I think there've been Islamic sects, especially when it comes to ISIS, who've been concerned with affecting or changing or altering that deep history. The thing is that I described Mali historically as being a Muslim state, and it was, in the sense that the nobility were nominally Muslim. They practiced Muslim, they engaged in Muslim beliefs and Muslim practices, but it wasn't something that was that actually was widespread in the empire. It was mainly an elite practice, and even the emperor, because it's like, for example, the traditional gold miners were very resistant to changing their traditional beliefs and their traditional practices. So the Musa, the emperor, the Mansa, the emperor himself, had to still engage in certain traditional practices, animistic practices, etc. And I think that's something that is unpalatable to a lot of contemporary, especially very Muslims who might be, how do I put it? Just very engaged in that practice, pious, but also pious to an extremity, etc. I think also it's difficult, not difficult to say, but obviously the borders of the empire has changed a lot. There were a lot of conflicts in them with the Tuareg, for instance, and these were all the groups of Amazigh, these sort of indigenous Saharan peoples, especially who were living in the east of what was the empire, and they were the ones who initially inhabited places like Timbuktu, which was then conquered in the 15th century. And the empire has always kind of been growing and shrinking, and has always encompassed a wide range of different peoples, and in certain parts you had greater autonomy, etc. So I think there are still these historic, historic resentments and historic, historic resentments, and which affect people today, and which lead, I think, to some of the origins of that conflict. They actually have a deeper history and a deeper past that we might think of. But I think there is that aspect of maybe thinking that historically, there was a sense of, idolatry, etc., that is in Mali's history, because it was, it was an elite religion, something like Islam, which contemporary Muslims who are active in that region and who seek to destroy that would see as wouldn't see as the right way, basically.
Thank you. I'm afraid I think we have to leave it there. You'll have to grab Luke afterwards if you've got further comments or questions. I just want to say thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and also for answering so many great questions. I'm sure many of you will be keen to get a hold of a copy of Luke's book, which actually is available from our independent bookseller, Fox Lane Books. and he'll be downstairs signing books now after we leave this room. So please do come down. You can also grab him for an extra little question. So thank you very much for attending today's event, and be sure to check out what the next few weeks have in store in the festival programme. And yeah, thanks again. And let me just again say thank you to Luke.
Thank you so much. Thank you.